Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at the NextDrive Spectra X. This is a dongle style DAC, in this case USB-C, but it is available in USB-A as well. And with its price at $150 US, it sits towards the upper end of the single-ended only dongle DAC style devices. There are some that cost more, such as the AudioQuest Dragonfly Cobalt, but the Spectra X here is sitting up towards that end of the market, more so than the cheaper options like the Tempur-Tech Sonata HD Pro and similar such dongles that I've reviewed on this channel. So of course the question for this review is whether or not the Spectra X is worth the extra money compared to the competition. The Spectra X is designed around the ESS Sabre 9018 2QC DAC, and if that means absolutely nothing to you, don't worry about it. There are so many options from ESS that it's really not a big deal which chip a lot of these devices use. As you'll hear shortly, whether or not it's the 9018 as used here or the 9280 as used in the EarMen Eagle, most of the Sabre DACs on the market, in fact probably all of them on the market at this stage, are capable of producing really great sound. And the same is true for AKM, so realistically these days I don't think it's worth worrying too much about which DAC chips are used in which device, because in the end it comes to how they're implemented, what the output stage is like, how power is handled. All of those things play a bigger part these days than which DAC chip is used. What's really going to be more important is how this is to use as an everyday device, how it sounds of course, and whether it's got enough power to drive the headphones or earphones that you're looking to run. While we're talking chips and specs and things like that, let's talk about the power available. The Spectra X outputs 49 milliwatts into a 32 ohm load, and that makes it moderately powerful for a portable device like this. To put things more into perspective though, I did a little bit of maths on this one, and the Spectra X here will comfortably drive, but towards the upper end of its capabilities, it will comfortably drive things like the Sundara, which are slightly more difficult than average planar, and will fairly comfortably drive something like the HD650 from Sennheiser, which is a higher impedance dynamic headphone. So it should have you covered for most headphones, ranging everywhere from the slightly more difficult planar magnetics all the way through to the higher impedance dynamics. Of course, we're not going to start talking about driving really difficult planars with this. It's a portable device pulling all of its power from your phone or a USB socket on a computer. So it's not going to have the grunt to drive something like a Susvara or an HE6, but it should have you covered for most other headphones on the market. To actually put that to the test, I did try this with the Sundara and also with the DT880 250 ohm that I have. And in both cases, the Spectra X was driving it from my smartphone with pretty comfortable volume. So for normal listening levels, which is going to be in the high 70 decibel range for me, sort of somewhere between say 77 and about 83 decibels, the Spectra X was handling the Sundara at about 75% volume, and the DT880 250 ohm was taking just a bit more at about 80% volume. So there wasn't a lot of headroom to spare, but the volume levels were good. It means if you're using a lot of EQ, particularly in the bass regions, you may find it starts to run out of puff and clip the signal, which is going to create distortion and make it a less enjoyable experience. But if you're not listening at high volumes and or using a lot of EQ to boost, you can always cut EQ of course if you want to, but if you're not boosting a lot of the bass and or listening at high volumes, the Spectra X is pretty capable for most headphones. And of course for all IEMs you can think of, the Spectra X will do just fine. In terms of compatibility, I've used the Spectra X with 0 drivers at all, both in my Windows laptop and also with my smartphone of course. So I use USB Audio Player Pro with devices like this, and it connected up straight away, no issues at all, as do most dongles with an Android smartphone. With the computer, the same experience was true. I plugged it in and it just worked. So there were no drivers required, there were no issues, it just plugged in and played. Speaking of computer audio, being that this does use a Sabre DAC chip, as again with most of the modern DAC chips today, it will handle DSD and high PCM sample rates. So in all cases, it's going to handle everything you can throw at it. The only thing it doesn't have, which for some people may be important, is it doesn't do MQA decoding. So all of your standard file formats like PCM, DSD, MP3, and when I say PCM, that means FLAC, Apple lossless, any of those, it's going to handle those just fine. It just won't do MQA if you listen to something like Tidal. And so with all that out of the way, let's talk about how the Spectra X sounds. My very first impression of this is that it's rich and fun and engaging. It's got a fairly rich, punchy and dynamic sound, but that doesn't mean that it's slow or bloated or lacking in detail. It's just got a nice sense of bottom end weight to it and maybe just a tiny little bit of bass emphasis. It's not huge, it's not massively colouring the sound, but as you'll hear when I compare it to the EarMen Eagle shortly, it definitely does bring a character of its own. I'd say the general tonality is very good, so it's not overly colouring things to the point that anything sounds unnatural, but it does definitely have a slightly richer tone compared to what I would consider truly neutral. And again, that's just based on my perception of neutral, so others may have a slightly different experience. The final thing to talk about in terms of sound quality is that there's a good sense of width in the soundstage and a little bit of depth, but not a huge amount. And honestly, most of these dongle DACs don't produce a huge amount of soundstage depth, so as long as you've got good image and good width, that's generally all you can ask for. And in the case of the Spectra X, I think it delivers perfectly for what I'd expect at this sort of price point. As is always the case with things like amps and DACs, I think the best way to put the sound quality and the performance of it into context is to put it up against something at a similar price point with a similar function. In this case, it's the EarMen Eagle here. So straight away, one of the things you're going to notice is the design differences. The Eagle is a little kind of flat rectangular shape here, and it's got a USB-A socket for a computer and then a fly lead if you want to plug it in to your phone, for instance, with USB-C. What that means is, whilst in some ways it's more versatile because it can go into USB-A or USB-C, it also makes it a slightly clumsier setup because you've got one extra connection involved and it's not quite as sleek and slimline as the Spectra X here. The Spectra X has got a wonderful, wonderful form factor, and it really becomes just an extension of your earphone or headphone wire rather than being an inline device, which is what the Eagle feels like. Both are beautifully designed and made. They've both got just a single-ended 3.5mm output, so in many ways they're very, very similar, but I do like the form factor of the Spectra X just a little bit more. Whilst I've never had major issues with disconnections during use, I do feel more secure with this all-in-one design rather than having a connection to the phone, a connection to the dongle, and then a connection to the headphones. There's just extra connections there that are asking to potentially be bumped and create a disconnection. So it's a really minor issue, but I do prefer the Spectra X in that regard. The final thing I should mention before I talk about sound is that the Eagle is slightly cheaper than the Spectra X. So the Eagle comes in at about $130, whereas the Spectra X is about $150. And by the way, for any Aussies watching, that equates to about 195 Australian, being the Spectra X here. So let's talk about how they sound. These two DACs have quite a different presentation within the realms of not going too far in terms of coloration, but allowing a bit of variation and choosing the one that maybe suits your personal tastes and your headphones or earphones the best. I found that in comparing the two, using the same tracks of course and the same earphones and headphones, I found that Eagle separated the sounds just a little bit better and a little bit more than the Spectra X did. There was a clearer sense of space and separation between sounds, and it made it easier to kind of listen through the music and pull things apart a bit. Having said that, it's not like the Spectra X feels congested, it's like it brings it all together into a more coherent kind of sonic picture, I guess you could call it. But at the same time, the Eagle doesn't over-separate things and make it non-coherent. So they're very much just what I would call different places along a very acceptable continuum of separation to coherency. Neither one gets too congested or too spread apart. While we're talking about the soundstage presentation, let's talk about the size and depth. I think, and it's very close here, but I think the Eagle maybe does a slightly better job at width of the soundstage, but it is very, very close. The soundstage from the Spectra does feel a little bit closer to you as a listener, but again, not too much so. The Eagle just pushes everything back a little bit further and maybe has just a hint more depth in the soundstage, but not enough that I'd split the decision based on that alone. Where things are probably most different is in the tonal characters of the two. I've already mentioned that the Spectra X has a slightly warmer, richer, kind of thumpier sound to it. The Eagle, on the other hand, errs towards neutrality and maybe even a slightly more analytical sound, but it doesn't lose its sense of soul or engagement in the music. That slightly cleaner, leaner sound from the Eagle does mean that things like textures in vocals, breathiness, things like that will come through a little bit more from the Eagle, and so from that point of view, it creates a sense of maybe slightly greater resolution and textural detail, but it's more of just a different presentation. I don't feel like anything's being smoothed over or specifically lost in the Spectra X. It's just that the two of them pull your attention in different directions. One clear difference between the two is that the Spectra X definitely has bass that hits harder and has more weight to it than what you get from the Eagle. As to which one's better, that's very much a personal decision. I think the Eagle might be ever so slightly closer to the true, kind of truer to source recording if you like, but at the same time the Spectra X does it very, very tastefully, so I didn't ever feel like it was bloating or slowing the bass or overdoing it to the point that it was interfering with the rest of the signature. In fact, what I found was that it made the music far more engaging and fun without skewing it or acting like I'd applied any kind of EQ. So I still felt like I was hearing the true version of the song and the true capabilities and characteristics of the earphones and headphones, but just with a nice extra touch, and we're talking like 1% or 0.5% of extra bass, warmth and punch. So at this point, if you're sitting there thinking, yep, so which one's better, which one's worse, the reason you're thinking that is because I don't really know. I can't answer that question on this one. I think both are really fantastic devices. I think if I had to choose between the two, I'd have a really, really hard time. On one hand, I'd err towards the Eagle because I feel like maybe it's giving me just a little bit more resolution, or at least it's drawing my attention to that resolution just a little bit more and making it sound a bit more articulated and a bit more separated and detailed. But then when I listen to the Spectra X, it's just so fun and so engaging. The form factor of the Spectra X is clearly superior to me. I love this tubular design and the fact that it is an all-in-one device. That really wins out for me in terms of the form factor. And so it's a really tough decision. I think the things that I would use to make a decision, and therefore I suggest that probably you have a think about if you're in the market for one of these two sorts of devices, is have a think about whether or not you want the all-in-one style or whether you value having a USB-A connection like that and then using a fly lead. Another thing to think about is whether you want the little square sort of rectangular design or whether you like the tubular design. And then of course start thinking about what you're using it with and where you're using it. So if you've got earphones or headphones that are a little bit on the lean and analytical side and you're having to warm them up a little bit with EQ, or you just wish they were a bit warmer in general, then the Spectra X would definitely be the choice. If, on the other hand, you've got richer, warmer sounding headphones or earphones, you may want something that's a little bit more neutral and leaner, and in that case the Eagle would be better. The final thing to take into account is where you're going to be using these. If you're using these outdoors, then often you're going to have background noise. For instance, if you're walking down the street, there's going to be cars, traffic, general noise around you, and most of that noise when you're using IEMs or closed-back headphones is going to conduct through the bones of your skull and come through at the lower frequencies. What that means is you're better off having a bit of extra bass in the reproduction to offset the effects of that background noise, and therefore I think the Spectra X is probably the better device in a commuting and outdoor situation. Ultimately, I don't think you can go too far wrong with either. I think both are fantastic devices, and so you're going to have to factor in those various things I've just mentioned, and of course price as well, because there is a difference of about sort of 20 or so US dollars, so you're going to have to factor all those in for yourself. As much as I normally like to provide some direction and say which product I think is definitively better or worse in different situations, I really don't think you can go too far wrong with either of these. I think they're both great choices, and it's actually really nice for a change for me to be able to sit here and say, whichever way you go, I think you're going to be really happy. As always, some of you are going to be wishing that I'd compared the Spectra X to specific other devices, and as always, all I can say is I can only work with what I have here. So I apologise if I haven't touched on a device that you're particularly interested in. If you want to ask me down below if I have heard those devices, I'm happy to help, but do keep in mind there's a whole lot that I haven't heard because there's such a flood of these sorts of devices on the market. I will say that having heard the AudioQuest Dragonfly Red and definitely and comfortably preferring the Eagle, I can therefore say that I think the Spectra X is also better than the Dragonfly Red. Both of these are also better than things like the Sonata HD Pro, and generally in my experience, when you do spend a bit more on these sorts of products, you do get the benefits of better sound quality. That's not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes we do get amazing products at lower prices, but so far in my testing of various dongles, I'm yet to find a lower priced product that actually performs as well as some of these guys. But as I said before, there is still a whole bunch of these sorts of devices I need to get to, and as always, I am working to get loaner units of any of them and all of them, so do stay tuned and I'll get to them if I can. If having heard this though, you're sold on the Spectra X, and I think if that's a decision you make, I think personally it's a really good decision. So if you're sold on the Spectra X and you're looking to buy one for yourself, I'll put some links down below where you can go and check out more details and pick one up for yourself. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the like button. It really helps me to keep bringing content like this to you and sharing these videos with other people like you as well. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.